Cost of living, of course, remains the main issue in the country. We talk about it every night for a reason. But I've got to say, it's time to now call out the people who are not passengers but are participants in the Australian economy. The Prime Minister and his Treasurer, Grim Jim, the man who would one day hope to take over from the greatest Prime Minister of all time. Now, sure, they play the part of pretending that they're in charge of the economy. When it comes to the budget, there they are, flicking through the papers. Oh, it's a wonderful increase in spending. How are you paying for it? Doesn't matter. What? Deficits for the next 40 years? Yeah, who cares? We'll keep being re-elected. Everyone just wants a handout, right? Of course, they have now rigged the Reserve Bank because they didn't like the decisions that the independent Reserve Bank was making. So while it remains completely independent, the hand-picked new boss has a completely new, yet-to-be-announced hand-picked crew of people who aren't the Reserve Bank but a special subcommittee of the Reserve Bank who will meet fewer times than they have ever met before, just 8 times a year, to deal with interest rates. Oh, nothing to see here. And of course, the Treasurer thinks that you're an idiot who doesn't know your own life. The Treasurer thinks that you, if you own a business, are doing as well as the biggest businesses in the country. He thinks that if you are on a fixed income, then everything is rosy, because you see, the overall picture of the Australian economy still stays slightly in positive territory, if only because of the mining sector, the same sector that they're doing everything they can to tax and shut down, and that's what Labor's doing at the federal and state level. But the Treasurer says, like a Jedi mind trick or the person trying to get you to not realise your own circumstances are your own circumstances, he says, like the Lego movie, everything is awesome.
The Australian economy remains steady and sturdy in the face of unrelenting pressure.
But the reality for 25 million Australians is that's not true. It might be fine for the people who are the passengers in Canberra, the stewards in Canberra, the salespeople in Canberra. But as we told you last week, the reality for you is that you're in a recession. A per capita recession means the population is going backwards. And there's a few indices that I want to point out here that are the absolute opposite of what you were promised from the people who are now in charge of the Australian economy. Remember when the former government had data about how many people were working multiple jobs? Well, that was a sign of how terrible the economy was and why there was a need for a change. Here he was before he became Prime Minister.
There are 500,000 people, are working 3 jobs or more. 500,000. Think about that, 3 jobs or more.
Well, the number of people with multiple jobs in Australia has gone up, way up, since the Albanese government came to power. As you can see from this graph from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, you do not need to be an economist nor a genius to work out that the down part there was the COVID pandemic, and the number that has exploded, not with population, because our population has not exploded since 2020. Yes, there's been an addition of about 700,000 people, but the number of Australians who have to work more than one job to make ends meet is going through the roof. This bloke said that if he voted for him, cost of living would be lower. Of course, it is way higher. He said a sign of a bad economy is the number of people who have to work more than one job to make ends meet. Well, by his own standard, he is failing. And also the number of hours that we are working, regardless of whether you have multiple jobs or you, in fact, have just one, is going through the roof. As you can see, this analysis of those national accounts via news.com.au shows you it went backwards during the pandemic, and now it is surging, the number of hours that you have to work in order to make ends meet. Again, when he was applying for the job, this was a reason why he needed to be the new CEO. This is why the Treasurer had to change and had to become Grim Jim. But the reality is that it has all got worse since they took over. And while they like to pretend that it's all cyclical, you know they have made multiple decisions that has made life harder. Meantime, the Prime Minister constantly talked about this, the expectation that everyone in Australia, all 16 million workers, were going to get a pay rise should he become the Prime Minister.
A Labor government I lead will back a real pay rise.
Well, the reality is that, yes, there have been some changes to awards, but when it comes to the pay rise for people like aged care nurses, that's funded by the government. The government is literally locking in billions of dollars of spending each and every year to top up the existing payments for people who work in aged care. But again, let's have a look at some actual numbers here about the reality of the economy as it is. That yes, while there has been a slight uptick from the downturn of a few years ago, wage growth is only back where it was in 2012. So we're more than a decade on from that period of time, yet growth in wages is in fact lower than it was even before Tony Abbott became Prime Minister. And even though some people have got a pay rise, the majority of people who have not got a pay rise, well, of course, the cost of everything has gone up, which means real wages, the cost of that $1 coin and what you can buy with it has gone backwards. If you don't believe me, what about the Canberra Times and their economics editor, hardly a right-wing think tank? But he talks about real wages. The real wages, taking into account inflation, are still going backwards. Because the reality is everything costs more, way more than it did a couple of years ago, an absolute millennium, it feels like, of price increases since 2012. Things are going backwards. Now, while wages may be going up by 3.6%, inflation is the best part of 6% over the same period of time. And even now that the headline number's down to 4.9%, the reality is that things like food and insurance is still way above average. And then, of course, there is paying off a house. What is the reality after more than a year of the Albanese government? Well, the reality is that when interest rates started to go up during an election campaign, just once, it was a cost of living crisis.
This is a full-blown cost of living crisis on Scott Morrison's watch, and now interest rate rises are about to be part of the pain. Now, this Prime Minister has an excuse for everything and a plan for nothing.
But the reality is there have now been 11 interest rate rises under the Albanese government, 12 overall, since May of 2022. Reason for new management was just one. Well, what the heck do Australians have to say about 11 increases that have happened after that? With a cash rate that, yes, was very low because our economy was booming and there was a great need to stimulate the economy due to the COVID pandemic. But still, 11 times it's gone up on their watch when it was one on the other guys. Oh, the sky was falling in. Well, does the sky still exist when there's been 11 of them? What does this mean? Remember, that dollar that doesn't buy what it did a year ago, let alone what it did 12 years ago, well, the cost now to the average person paying off a mortgage, and that's about $500,000. So do your sums, whether you're a little higher or a little lower or way higher than that number, if you happen to be trying to pay off a house in Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane, where the price is closer to $1 million. Well, the average number of those that are paying off at just a $500,000 mortgage is $14,000 more since Anthony Albanese became the Prime Minister and Grim Jim was the shepherd of the Australian economy. $14,000. When it comes to food as well, in the past 12 months, even longer now, that too has become a massive problem. Now, multiple websites have done this, but it was the ABC who decided to repeat some of this work today about a famous promise that was made in 2017 by one of the supermarket chains, Coles. Coles told you that you could feed a family of four for under $10. Well, they, again, and multiple other websites, but this is the one that was out today, so I'm going to focus on their analysis. What's happened to the $10 meals of 2017 in September of 2013? Well, if you want to have a cottage pie, what was $10 is now $28.30 because of its variety of ingredients. Mince has gone from $4.35 to now $11. What about a beef burger? Well, that was part of the less than $10 can feed a family. Well, now it's $18.60. As 190 grams of middle bacon goes from $1.88 to $2.40, a 28% increase. The overall, 90% higher than it was in 2017 under Albo's watch. What about some fettuccine bolognese, if that's your thing? What was a $10 meal in 2017 is now a $24.67 meal. That's a 146% increase. Now, you know this, but the economy is incredibly resilient. You know this, but you're paying $14,000 at least more paying back a house than you did before this bloke became the Prime Minister and Jim Chalmers became the Treasurer. I'm not even getting into the conversation about power prices or trying to pay off insurance, but all of that way higher than anyone expected. Because remember, the promise was hundreds of thousands of jobs and $275 reduction, none of which has happened. So are things about to get better? If you believe the Treasurer, if you believe the Prime Minister, if you believe the Labor talking points, we are through the worst of it. So let's have a look at what an independent economist had to say today. Guess what? He told the Sydney Morning Herald, that being Chris Richardson, the independent economist, the worst of budget pain is yet to come, meaning the virtual doubling in supermarket products, the $14,000 increase in how much you have to pay off your house, the real wages that are going backwards, so your dollar is at best worth what it was in 2012. Well, Chris Richardson says, and his last line is the one to pay attention to, I think the overall pain gets worse from here. But of course, Albo and the Treasurer, well, they're not going to feel any of the pain, are they? Apart from the pay rises that came from becoming the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, despite the fact that the Finance Minister, who we all knew lied to the Parliament about the Kimberley Kitching affair, well, she got her pay rise. And now every single politician, regardless of whether they sit at the backbenches of the opposition or are the Prime Minister of the country, have now received their biggest pay rise in a decade. If you got a pay rise, most likely in a low-skill, low-wage, unionised sector, it's still not enough to cover inflation. For most people, they haven't got a pay rise. For too many people, they're working 2 or 3 jobs. Yet the Prime Minister who says everything is awesome, everything is fine, Jedi mind trick it, use the Men in Black memory wiper. You are not living through a cost of living crisis. You are not in a per capita recession. They get the highest pay increase in 10 years. Oh, but it was completely independent. We couldn't overrule it, we couldn't deny it, we couldn't turn it down. As for the public servants, and remember the Labor Party idea is to replicate what's been happening in Queensland and in Victoria, which is you want people to be dependent on government. They must be dependent on government. That way you have a permanent majority for the Labor Party. You see, if you have a business, your biggest client should be the government, even though they don't pay within 90 or even 120 days often. If you're a citizen, you should be dependent on welfare handouts, or, like hundreds of thousands of people in the country, you literally work for the government. But of course, they're very clever about where all of these public servants are. Yes, there's a lot in Canberra. But just like the experience has been in Queensland and in Victoria, you want to spread them out to as many electorates as possible. Because then when anyone preaches the virtues of balancing a budget, that the expectation is will be in deficit for the next 40 years, according to the intergenerational report, well, that's a cut. A cut. The black and white ads get rolled out, the spooky music for the politician who says the government needs to stop spending more money than it receives. Because as their expectation is, there's going to be 45 million people in Australia by 2060. And despite the fact that many of those people, of course, will work and therefore will pay taxes, and there'll be more tax than ever before, the size of government, the decisions made by this Prime Minister and by this Treasurer that will be furthered by this Treasurer when he becomes the Prime Minister and whoever the heck forms the position of Treasurer when there's a change in leadership at some point in time, as is always the way in Australian politics, you pay more. All day, every day. But the people who rely upon government, well, surprise, they are doing better than they have ever done in 10 years. Talk about a difference between the BS world of Canberra and the reality of where you are sitting tonight.